My name's Andrea Ford. I'm a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a medical anthropologist and I work in the medical school, which is kind of an interesting spot for an anthropologist in a very interdisciplinary group. I'm from California originally, but have been living in the UK for about 6 years now.
Well, thank you for joining us. We'll be talking about your book, Near Birth, Contested Values and the Work of Doulas. So I always ask the first question, which is, how did you come to write this book? And was there anything that you learned in writing it that particularly stood out to you?
So the book is based on my PhD research, and it was about 10 years in the making. So how did I come to write it is a very long kind of story. I guess we could delve into it a little bit more. How did I come to be interested in birth or become a doula, things like that. So I became interested in birth kind of philosophically, actually. I thought the anthropology of the body was fascinating, how bodies are understood differently in different places and in different times. And then the pregnant body was one of the most cool, crazy, fascinating examples of things bodies can do that are understood differently. And then from there, knowing that I wanted to do practical, hands-on research, as anthropologists tend to do, I wanted to be in places with people giving birth. But I didn't want to just be observing, hanging on. It's not really something where you want strangers in the room. So I thought, oh, become a doula just so that I can give something back and be relevant while I'm spending time with people who've kindly, generously allowed me to be with them during this process. Then I ended up really loving doula work. It was such a different way of being, a way of being present, I suppose, than you often are as an academic. Um, so I guess I continued doula work after the research even because I found it so satisfying. Something that surprised me did you ask something that surprised me about writing the book or that I learned while doing it?
Learned while doing it. Yeah, something you learned.
Um, I think one of the things that's top of mind is how to navigate between what's timeless or at least has a longer time frame and what's timely. Because a lot of the themes in the book are timely, particularly right now in the US with the situation around reproductive rights and gender relations. But because the writing and the research took place over a decade, sometimes when I was finalizing it, I was like, this is so out of date. What do I do about that? And some parts of it I did update, even though it was kind of more technically beyond the scope of the research project, because I felt that was really important. But moreover, I was trying to think about themes that are less about the minute kind of changes of the moment and more durable, more like deep-seated.
Well, it seems like you did a pretty good job of doing that in the book. And I would love to begin, before we get into the actual book, just explain to us what a doula is and what they do in the birth process, because I think it's something we hear a lot about in this space, but I'm not sure there's great definition and a definition that kind of puts it against midwifery.
For sure. So doulas are non-medical birth attendants. They or we offer different kinds of support. So informational support, if people would benefit from having some information about options, bodies, likelihoods, their own emotions, sometimes kind of counseling type services, informational, emotional, physical. So bringing things during labor like water, doing massages, being in the room and having a calm presence. So all these things are kinds of support that a doula offers. Doulas don't have medical liability and they can't make medical recommendations. So that's the difference with a midwife, generally speaking, who is a medical professional, has liability, can make recommendations. That said, doulas and midwives are very similar because in the US, they both represent ways of caring about bodies giving birth that have been traditionally excluded from medical systems. So ways of being more caring, more slow, more building a relationship and less kind of intervention focused or technology focused than obstetrics tends to be. But I will just make a note that that's quite US specific. So in the UK, midwives are the first point of call for all births, whereas in the US, it's around 8% will be overseen by a midwife. So midwifery care is still a bit marginalized itself. Doulas can be part of a birth in any setting and in any with any other kinds of providers. I think the real benefit of having a doula is that for a variety of reasons, usually it makes the birthing person more relaxed. And when they're more relaxed, birth actually happens better physiologically. So sometimes it gets dismissed as like a nice to have, like, oh, it's good if you feel comfortable, but that's not a real medical procedure. And I would push back on that and say, well, actually, because birth isn't an illness or a problem necessarily, if somebody is relaxed, the body will function better. And if they're tense and so in some ways, depending on how you frame it, it is a medical intervention or medically relevant.
Well, and that brings up the first part of your book, which talks mainly about the culture around birth and birthing bodies and the history and how American culture, especially Californian culture, which is, having lived there for a little bit of time, a very strange place for a number of reasons. But
Mhm.
could you talk about the first chapter and how you frame the entire discussion of the book as this understanding within culture and where female bodies and birthing kind of fit in there?
Yeah, a great question. I do think California is a strange place as well, in a really productive way. I think it's like a strong personality, and it in the book I say that it's generative. So sometimes Um, you might think you want research to be representative of some kind of average, and I don't think California is that. But it's where new ideas often take place and things that seem a little bit maybe crazy start to be tested out. So it has had this role as part of America for at least 150 years, right? Kind of since the gold rush, although you could trace the genealogy in different ways. Um, it was also because of this or as part of this, I would say the main home of the natural childbirth movement in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. Of course, that was happening elsewhere, but I think a key driver internationally was California and the Bay Area in particular. So ideas about gender and bodies and how those fit with technologies and ideas of a good future and progress were being worked out for decades. So I thought it was an interesting place to do research. Also, as I mentioned, that's where I'm from. So I had a kind of curiosity about home. Sometimes when home starts to feel strange to you, then you can dig into that, and that's quite interesting as an anthropologist. Um, the first chapter talks a lot about progress. So all the chapters are about a different value, which is something that is usually considered good, but what it actually means, how to do it, why it's good are really can be quite contested or contentious. So progress, what does progress look like? What kind of future are we progressing towards? And you see this in a lot of current Silicon Valley stuff. Is AI going to be a key part of our future? Is that utopian or dystopian? And I think you see that with medical research and with gender and bodies more expansively as well.
Well, and I appreciated the kind of the challenging and you do this throughout the book, challenging the binary of,
Mhm.
mechanized, official, medical, science-based intervention versus kind of the um, more natural birth, female led, let the body do what the body's going to do, um,
Mhm.
kind of dynamic. And then you kind of plug in these different interventions or negotiations that try to offer a third way between them, or sometimes pick up one aspect of like medical intervention and say this is terrible and we have to fight back against this specific thing versus, and I think the perfect metaphor comes up, or the perfect example of this comes up in the physiology chapter when we start talking about um, reliance on male intervention, pain reduction as a feminist issue, these kind of
Mhm.
things. So I'd love for you to talk about how you negotiate not only the kind of that binary, but also some of the interventions that challenge or upset that binary.
Another great question. I think that's precisely the point, to challenge the binaries. And a lot of times, particularly in birth, which is one of the things that drew me to it as a field of, or as a kind of topic. But you can see it in lots and lots of different things. There's an impulse to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, technology is bad. We don't want any of that. We want to just have like purely natural, which is silly. I mean, there are life-saving technologies that we should be very grateful for. Vice versa, we shouldn't technologize everything. Bodies are quite amazing, quite capable, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I was curious about in starting this work was, why is there such a strong impulse to have one or the other? Like, why is it difficult to live in that gray zone? And when I was working with people, it was obvious that everyone was in the gray zone all the time, whether they're giving birth or supporting people giving birth. Like, everyone's always making hybrids, making combinations, like trying to make the best decision using different ideas, but always the ideas are so polarized. The ideas are such considered uh, they're powerful in their extremes, like that technology will save us or that nature is pure. These showed up all the time, even as people were doing hybrid practices. And that was interesting to me. And I think it shows up in how we think of the body and the mind division, which is a lot of what the physiology chapter digs into. I mean, most people would say, oh, yeah, of course, the body and the mind are connected. And yet, we still really tend to think of them as disconnected. And the idea that the body is just the body is so deep-seated, it's really hard to do without. So, kind of like I was saying at the beginning, being relaxed changes your physiology. And there's a bit about hormones and how this works. And so the idea that you can't treat the body like a machine that doesn't exist in a social, emotional context, but counterbalancing that against, you don't want to just throw caution to the wind, do something really risky when you have the privilege of options and technologies. And within that space, what is so how do you find that middle ground? How do you negotiate it? And I think pain is a good window onto that. Um, no, again, there's this idea that either pain is labor pain in particular is empowering or it's awful. But actually, for the people that I work with, it was always in between. It was like, I'm going to try to do it for a while until it becomes too much. So just you get this tension between these extreme ideas that are culturally relevant and how people make sense of them on the ground.
Yeah, and let's dig into that a little bit more because the interventions, medical interventions of like epidurals and Pitocin, is that how you say that? Or Pitocin?
Pitocin, yeah.
Pitocin, yeah, of course, the Pitocin, the way I don't do it. Um, and kind of unpack that a little bit because I was surprised to learn that there was a feminist pushback saying, why should we be in pain? That again reified or reaffirmed those biological differences and essentialism of like women are not able to process pain as well, or maybe they have a higher tolerance. These discredited medical theories become a point at which an argument can be made for an intervention that I found is located in a specific period of time, but stretches forward in problematic ways. So using epidurals and some of these other interventions, could you tell us what you were arguing?
Yeah. Um, Pain is so complicated and like currently doing a lot of work on endometriosis, which you may have heard of as a chronic pain condition that is related to menstruation. And so the question of women's pain in different spaces is as old as hysteria, which is ancient Greek, right? Like, how should we deal with this? Is this normal? Is it not? Is it acceptable? Is it not acceptable? And so the first wave feminism kind of aligned in roughly with suffrage movement for pain relief in childbirth was like a key agenda item for feminists who thought that it was like a rights issue, like that it was an opportunity to be more civilized, to sort of overcome one of the um, inherent disadvantages almost of being female. And so that was the scopolamine era, 1920s-ish, a little earlier, depending on European and American timelines that you're looking at. Interestingly, this is just a side note as to your very important question, but scopolamine is an amnesiac. So it makes you forget what has happened. It doesn't actually relieve pain, but it was hailed as a really great transformative option, and wealthy women would really request it and make sure that they could have it. And then epidurals became widely available and became part of an apparatus that treated women's bodies as machines. So it wasn't so much about epidural technology or pain relief per se, but that accessing this came as part and parcel of literally being in an assembly line, the way that early hospitals, after sterile technique, hospitals became places people wanted to give birth instead of places where people who had no other option gave birth. And as they became more kind of modern and prestigious, they were literally designed like factories. So you'd have a waiting, like a triage room, a labor room, delivery room, and then a nursery for the baby and a recovery room. And it would just be like this. And the woman's body was just a vessel for the baby, which was delivered by the doctor, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the context in which you could have pain relief. And you get a reaction against that that celebrates women's bodies as powerful and pain as productive. And I think the whole back and forth of this is pushing against the binaries that we've been talking about. It's like, again, you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can have pain that's good. You can have pain relief that isn't that doesn't remove your agency. But the systems that we've created don't offer that middle ground.
Well, that's a perfect lead way into the autonomy and trust parts of your book, where this is really where you start to challenge some of these binaries. And can you talk to us about some of the ways birthing people and their partners begin to assert autonomy against these systems of, mechanized birth and seeing the body as a machine, um, and trying to restore some personal power and choice into the birthing space?
Yeah, so the chapter on autonomy, I think it's nice to think of it etymologically. It means self-naming. So being able to tell your own story. And that's very tied up with bigger American ideas of individualism and being able to create your own destiny. Um, and choice has a big history in feminism, tends to be associated with white feminism, because it presumes people have options amongst which to choose. It's often updated by reproductive justice as a more capacious framework, but I think autonomy is still, even within a justice framework, still really valued by most people. And you see this in lots and lots of metaphors, like I'm on a journey, I'm making my way on my journey, I'm doing what's right for me. And that comes into doula advice a lot of the time. Doulas act as facilitators for someone's autonomy. So rather than telling them what to do or what would be best, you are like a mirror. You're like, well, what would that feel like for you? Or like, where does that desire come from? Or try and help the person do what's kind of coming from within almost. And there is a very popular birth class called Birthing from Within. And so I sat in on a number of these and was part of them. And a lot of the clients that I worked with were part of this. And I think it's just such a apt name because it describes this particular idea of the authentic as coming from within. And one of the later chapters is about authenticity, but I can touch on it a little bit here that that's the source of truth, that that's how you'll be able to feel good and know that you've done the right thing. And in a space like birth, where there's so much concern about doing the wrong thing, like things feel risky, things feel heavy, like what if you make the wrong choice? What if it hurts the baby? What if I never recover? There's a lot of anxiety about doing the right thing. And this is the contemporary answer. It's like, well, what's the right thing for you? How do we figure that out? And I talk about this across four themes. So, ooh, can I remember them now? Pain and power. And, oops,
Is it the peas?
those the P's show up in a few spots. I thought that
There's
well,
one like
maybe.
passenger. I
So the
think,
P's
yeah.
are like an obstetric teaching tool, the passenger, the pelvis, and the powers. I wasn't necessarily referring to those, but yeah, the idea is it's a machine model, right? That there's the pelvis, the woman's body, it's not the woman's body, it's not a person, it's a pelvis. And the passenger is the baby, again, passive. And then the powers are the strength of the contractions, which you can augment with Pitocin, or bypass with a cesarean. So it's just all very mechanical. And then in the physiology chapter, I note that in a more holistic teaching paradigm, the P's have multiplied. So you get things like patience and uh, uh, was placenta one of them? There's like seven, but there's a more holistic picture. Anyway, in the autonomy chapter, I talk about trust and control as being the way that you figure out what's right for you. Like, what do you want to trust and what do you want to control? And they're kind of inverses. They're like two sides of the same coin. If you want to trust nature, um, then you have to relinquish control. If you want to control through kind of technological means, usually, then you have to distance yourself and distrust, or the reason is often that you distrust what's natural. And again, that's kind of a binary, but one that people made use of all the time to figure out how to do this complicated thing, which is what is my true desire? What is the right choice? Where's my autonomy?
Right. And one of the things that challenges that is this hypnobirthing that you mentioned
Mm.
in these chapters. And I think it challenges this idea that we've kind of danced around, which is that at some point, natural birth or the functioning of the female body has become has come to be seen as problematic first. So no birth is normal. There's no such thing as a, standard birth. Everything has a potential problem or is inherently problematic. So I think hypnobirthing challenges that or tries to negotiate that a little bit. Could you talk about that particular way of thinking about birthing?
Sure. Yeah. So there's an obstetric maxim that a birth can only be declared normal in retrospect, which is interesting, because you don't know if there's going to be a problem until it's over. Hypnobirthing, I thought it sounded really far-fetched. When I started this work, I was a little bit like I'd never given birth or been pregnant. And so I was coming in as an outsider to these worlds, as many of my clients eventually were, because we keep pregnancy and childbirth quite separate. So it can be quite shocking when you get thrown in and you've never thought about this before. So from my own perspective, it was like hypnobirthing, really? That's a thing? But it's quite popular, and the idea being that you can create a mental state that's with a sort of barrier, to keep scary or demanding kind of influences at bay, so that you can keep your body in that calmness, basically. And it's a way of training your reactions. We can talk about that with a variety of different kind of mechanisms, like maybe it's hormonal, maybe it's neurological, but you keep your body calm by sort of dissociating from what's happening. So people will have like a kind of maybe a signal, like a tap on the arm, that they and their partners will practice to bring them out of that almost dissociative state, and back into the room, which is interesting, or which is often necessary if they need to like sign a paper or make a decision, because the way medical systems are set up, we expect the pregnant person or the birthing person to be giving consent or making decisions. And that's complicated, because what does consent look like when you're really immersed in a very full-on process that brings you into kind of an altered state? It's not that you don't have, I don't mean to infantilize or say women don't have the capacity to consent in that state, but it can be very disruptive to assume that they're not going through something quite transformative. Uh, um, so yeah, anything more specific about hypnobirthing? That's the kind of my thoughts on it at the moment.
Yeah, when I read it, I felt very much like you. I was like, oh, this sounds very Bay Area, and then also at the same time, it sounds so like, oh, we want to dissociate and not be here, but it does make sense that like we have stressors, outside stressors, and
Mhm.
and then to instead of constantly trying to mediate them or engage them, like pushing them out, like this is
Yeah.
not what I need to do right now. I need to focus on what's going on in my body. So I want to move kind of quickly into equality and authenticity. Kind of skipping over power because I think we've handled that pretty well in negotiating some of our topics. But talk to me about this very fraught space because it brings up um, conversations that are not always easy to have and are privileged in a lot of ways. And when we talk about equality, are we talking about personal equality in the space of my birth, or are we talking about equality in the space of like all birth, all women, all birthing people? It just gets incredibly, um, you know what I'm saying? Not nuanced, but incredibly global very quickly. And so, yeah, let's talk about that.
Like my claim is that all of these values are this sort of thing where you're like, obviously that's good. But you say it can go across scales, it can mean different things. It's really complicated. There's a commonly made distinction between equality and equity. Equality being sameness, essentially, and equity being same result. I won't go into that too much, but the basic kind of problem in that chapter is that bodies that can give birth, or women's bodies, usually bodies that can't give birth, have different capacities. And when you need reproduction in society to keep society going, how do you integrate bodies with different capacities in a way that feels right? Right. So presumed value on equality between the genders, or between all genders or sexes, uh, as kind of a presumed feminist thing. I mean, if you don't presume that as a good thing, that's probably a separate issue. But if you take that as a starting point, it's really complicated to actually put that into practice, because they're not the same. They just have different capacities and different needs, and that becomes really highlighted in childbearing. You can kind of, I mean, I'm doing research on menstruation now, and so there's ways that that doesn't hold true outside of childbearing, but really becomes obvious during childbearing. And you can take an equity approach and say, oh, we need to sort of adjust for these differences in order to achieve the same outcomes. Easy conceptually, harder to do. Like, there's been a lot of resistance to, I mean, just thinking about the gender pay gap and how giving birth or having children can raise a father's salary and lower a mother's, right? These kinds of things. But the real problem that I see with equity as well is that it presumes the same desired outcome, and people don't necessarily want the same things. They don't want to fit into the same mold. So even if it requires different things to get everyone to the same place, and that would be like an equity model, which is better than an equality model, it still kind of reduces desires to some sort of obvious one size fits all. Like, oh, of course we all want to make as much money as possible, for example. And you can see this problem across any lines of difference, bodily difference in particular, right? How do you account for difference without making everything the same, but also not making everything really unequal and unfair? And I think that's, I mean, I don't know how to answer that, but hopefully by describing it a little bit more carefully, we kind of get out of these traps of like, well, we just need equal parenting. Like, great. And maybe we need to talk about that a little bit more, figure out what each person needs, and also what is the desired outcome? Like, what are we really striving for? And that's probably quite contextual and case by case.
Yeah, and this idea of the right ways to parent, the right ways to birth, the right ways, everyone has a specific agenda, or
Mm.
maybe agenda is too strong of a word, but everyone has a certain set of ideals that they want to
Mm.
reach, and those ideals sometimes are exclusionary as much as they are inclusive. And I think that's one of the things that you touched upon, and really it comes to a head in this idea of what are doulas paid? How are these people who are
Mm.
meant to be negotiation between, you know, advocates and negotiators and support? At the end of the day, we live in a capitalist society. These people are not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts, and it sets
Yeah.
up a problem, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. The equality problem in terms of gender and family making is sometimes or increasingly being solved, and I put that in quotes, by doulas. And that's when the question of pay comes in. Like, if you need an extra person to help with all of the work, and this is maybe particularly true for postpartum doulas who take care of a couple, a family, a person um, after the birth, while they're integrating the new baby into the household. Um, to some degree for birth as well. It disturbs the categories. We know what family is because it's based on love and not money. And there's a whole gendered history tied in with the history of capitalism, which I discuss, which is where this idea comes from. And there's the idea that there's labor, like wage labor, things that are part of the marketplace. That are separate from love, and other sociologists and social scholars have talked about this as well. But doulas, I think, are fascinating because they sit on that line and they do really intimate care work. I say they kind of, they're a little bit medical professional, they're a little bit therapist, they're a little bit your sister and your best friend. Um, so you have this intimacy, you have this accountability, but you also, you're not going to see them again. It's a professional relationship. You pay them to be accountable to you only, not to insurance or to the hospital. And so in some ways, it's like buying loyalty or buying love, which sounds wrong because we have, again, another binary, right, between what things fit with what. And it's like, oh, you shouldn't need to pay a person to be kind to you while you're giving birth. But on the other hand, we value things in a capitalist society by paying for them. Money arbitrates value. And if that's important, and if you want someone to do that, then then you need a money relationship to like create that space or to create that position. So it's just really complicated. And in a lot of ways, I think doulas are these hybrids or these liminal figures who have a foot in both worlds. And because of that, show us how these binaries don't work. They create a lot of problems.
And I know there is quite a few organizations in Cleveland that are African American doulas, and they're trying to get because it seems to be just based on the structure you described, wealthy white people are most likely to be able to afford and keep a doula longer and negotiate
Mhm.
that space longer. And some African American and poor people don't have the luxury of adding another expense to birth, which is already expensive, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So there's a lot of organizations who are trying to find funding and give women and birthing people access to this service at a state sponsored or state paid rate, which is again fraught with politics and who's in charge of the money and all that kind of stuff. So it's never free of the superstructure, the systemic problems that we have set up for ourselves.
Absolutely. That was the key thing that I felt I had to update in the book when I was mentioning that earlier, that since I did my own field work, there have been a lot of, well, there's been more national attention to disparities in neonatal or perinatal mortality rates. And doulas increasingly hailed as the answer to this, which is a bit tricky. And I talk about this in the last chapter because doulas do a lot of help, but they also can't solve this problem single-handedly. Um, to come back to your point about payment, where the money comes from describes loyalties and accountability. And that's the tricky part that a lot of organizations have dealt with really creatively. And it's not the specific area of my research, but the ways that they navigate that, like sometimes refusing state funds, even when it would help their clients, because they don't want to be beholden to a certain kind of training, which they don't think suits what their clients need. But yeah, it's again showing a place where things break down because um
I think we can say capitalism because capitalism.
that's fair, yeah. And systemic racism and like
I mean, I
yeah.
think yeah,
Mhm.
but I want to kind of wrap up on toxicity.
Mm,
because this was one of the chapters that I found incredibly surprising,
mm,
because I don't think of the human body as poisoning itself very often. Um,
mm.
and that was part of this in like vaginal, yeah, the women,
Microbiome.
yes, microbiomes and things like this. But then there's the environmental toxins, which are really big right now, and microplastics and all this kind of stuff. So talk to us about breastfeeding, birth as toxicity, all the different ways in which parents and pregnant people try to negotiate and move around this space of environmental, just all the things that are bad for us, all the toxins that are out
So yeah, when I started this work, these were just starting to be I mean, in some spaces they'd been conversations for a long time, but very, very much just starting to be on like a national scale. Michael Pollan had just published a piece about the gut microbiome, which was really like, I think it was 2010 or something, and it was this new crazy thing. And now lots of people will have heard of the microbiome, and there's research on the vaginal microbiome, and there's actually, contrary to many decades of thinking that the womb was sterile, there's probably a placental, like an amniotic microbiome. There's definitely lactation microbiomes. So the way that microbes are in the body is becoming more and more known and talked about publicly. Similarly with chemical toxins, so with microplastics, with endocrine disruptors, which are chemicals that mimic or inhibit hormones, but they're produced outside the body and then they become inside the body. Lots of them are found in plastics. So those two issues are linked. Um, and then, so in that chapter, I talk about three kinds of toxins. So a lack of microbes, or kind of a sterile lifestyle, or sterile environment, um, chemical toxins, and stress. So again, blurring the mind-body line, stress is a kind of toxicity that if you have chronic stress, causes inflammation, causes it's called weathering, like early aging of the cells, lots of kind of early, like degenerative issues, potentially preterm birth. So stress gets into the body, chemicals get into the body, microbes are already in the body and are cultivated, or in all of these ways, we're immersed within the environment. And the chapters value this sort of contested idea is immunity, which I think will sound strange to people, maybe like to yourself, because we think of immunity as like vaccines and disease, but immunity technically or historically is a relationship of separation. So instead of community where you're together, you're immune, you're separate, you're safe, you're protected. So if you're immune to a disease, you can't get infected. You're safe. And if you're immune from your environment, you're protected from all these toxins. And the claim is that that's a value because we like to think that we're individuals and that we can protect ourselves, protect our family, protect our households, keep all the bad guys out. And the point of the chapter is that that's hard, if not impossible to do. Or I suppose the argument is that it's frankly impossible because in all these ways, always we're immersed in our environments. So you can't be immune to the bad guys, no matter how much money you have, how hard you try, etc.
there. And it again kind of reinforces this idea that the maternal body is somehow at war with the fetus and
Mm.
is responsible for the outcome of the birth. And it sets up this um, contested space, or somehow the mom or the maternal body can corrupt the fetus in a way that is sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, and really puts that stress on separating yourself, like you were saying.
There's a really long history to this idea. Absolutely. And it shows up in new ways all the time. Some fascinating work that other scholars have been doing about policing of bodies that might become pregnant. So even before they are pregnant, casual observation of the way that people feel that they have the prerogative to judge anybody who's pregnant for what they're doing, drinking, etc., whether they should or shouldn't be having a baby. I guess that there's lots of kinds of judgment wrapped up in that, but the mother's body as environment is a way of sidestepping this complicated way that all bodies are part of environments and that there's not a separation there. So another kind of key claim of the book is that because we want to be individuals and that that's so deeply ingrained in largely an American way of being in the world, but not exclusively by any means, being pregnant or childbearing, so having an infant as well, you can't be an individual. You're not an individual body. So how do we deal with that? And the emphasis on the maternal body as an environment for a fetus is just doubling down on the same idea that we're individuals. Only in this case, it is a mother-baby unit, and it's convenient and it ties into lots of misogynistic ideas about responsibility to make that something as though an individual mother or pregnant person could control what's going on.
And I was fascinated too about the breastfeeding, breast milk, and toxicity,
Oh, yeah.
and how even something as uh, natural as breastfeeding is a contested space. And sometimes by people you wouldn't expect to be contesting that. So could you just briefly give us the breastfeeding war or whatever you want to call it, controversy?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, branching off the toxicity thing, there's breast milk is full of toxins because our body's full of toxins, because toxins are often concentrated in fat, and breast milk has tons of fat, etc. So there's this, even amongst people who agree that they want to breastfeed and that breast milk is healthy, it's like, well, it's full of toxins. Like, well, it is still healthy. And so that's a kind of funny in the sense of just odd, like conversation about, well, we don't want to scare people off breastfeeding, but we do want to acknowledge that. Anyway, again, we can't separate ourselves from what we have been immersed in for generations. But coming back to breastfeeding versus formula feeding, which is, I think, maybe what you're wanting to touch on, I think it's just this double. Okay, so on the one hand, there hasn't been much research into breastfeeding. So if you actually have problems lactating, there's not a medical specialization for lactation. Shockingly, I mean, breastfeeding is what mammals are named after. It's such a kind of fundamental biological function, but it's just sort of kind of under the rug into obstetrics, maybe, or maybe pediatrics. So there's not a lot of information, not a lot of help. And then there's a lot of pressure around doing everything the right way in this total catch-22, where you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It was funny, there was an organization I was working with what were they doing? They were like handing out cards, but it was this funny inversion where in many cases people would feel publicly shamed for breastfeeding because they would be exposing a breast in a public place. Sorry if there's a little background noise right now. But someone was explaining to me they were handing out these cards like advocating for breastfeeding being healthy. And they said that, well, actually people feel judged if they're bottle feeding because there's such a kind of hippie culture around breast is best. And I think that has only expanded in the years since. So it's terrible catch-22 and reflects how we put too much responsibility on mothers.
Yeah, and I think you said something very important, especially about the Bay Area in California, which they should change the national or the state model to well, actually, because it seems like everyone has the more information than someone else, and they always have a new way of doing things. Like you were saying, it's a generative reinvention kind of space, a cauldron of ideas that sometimes are contradictory and all over the place. So wrapping us up, you bring us to a close in the book with activism, and I'd like you to sum up what that chapter did in the book. You say it was the hardest one to write, and I'd love for you to tell us if you could write it again right now, what would you add or to it that would update the activism and where we should go from here?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. So the last chapter is about redemption and the idea that some wrong has been done at some point and we need to fix things because they're broken. And I think many, if not most Americans would agree about that. Although what they think is broken and what we need to do to fix it, people have really, really different ideas and increasingly, polarized ideas. But the idea that something went wrong and is broken and we need to fix it, and it has this religious quality, which is why I chose this term redemption. Um, uh, so activism is one answer to this problem. It's also where I deal with the fact that I mostly worked with wealthier white people, which is a demographic that I fit into. And I won't go into too much detail about this, but on the one hand, that seemed ethical, even though it's not what I intended when I set out to do the research, because there's a long history of white people serving marginalized communities as sort of volunteerism, which is like a sort of saviorism. And doula work just works much better when somebody is from your own community because it's easy to feel comfortable with each other. So I mostly was involved in communities of color, marginalized birth work from a secondhand perspective, like through birth organizations, not through hands-on work within those communities. So the activism that's done by those communities and supported by other kind of social justice oriented birth work is aiming at a future of justice, of reproductive justice, where everyone can have children, not have children, and raise children in safe environments. But it's also grappling with whiteness and privilege in well-meaning whiteness and privilege, people who find it uncomfortable to acknowledge complicity, about different legacies of feminism, what that means, who belongs. And the chapter is really about like, how do you build a coalition, which I think is a really pertinent question for today. How do you come together across racial lines, across class lines, across ideological lines, with a similar goal in order to affect change more powerfully? You have to set aside differences, but also like not reduce them. Like you can't dismiss the differences either because they are really important and have historically been very significant to different groups. So this is just a tension, a challenge, a struggle, which is ongoing. How would I update that? I mean, I'm set to do more field work in California next year, and I have been away for a while now, and I imagine it will feel different in the United States. Of course, I'm in touch with family and such, but the I almost feel like I can't really speak to an updated version just having sort of watched the news or chatted with people. I feel like the sorts of feelings, like in a kind of bodily sense, that speak to these values and these problems, like longstanding problems that I'm really interested in. It's hard to figure that out from remote settings. So I guess what I would say, in keeping with the whole book, is that stepping back from binaries and finding not just common ground, but like a different way of looking at things, a different way of cutting the cake, a different kind of an attempt to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like would be the way forward.